Welcome to Red Pill Nation. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm speaking with Dave, better known as the Distributist online. Dave is a YouTuber and commentator who provides in-depth analysis of politics, culture, religion, and more. He and I have a lot to talk about as BLM and other woke orthodoxies continue their march through our institutions, and the 2020 election heats up considerably. You can follow Dave on Twitter at DataDistribute and subscribe to the Distributist YouTube channel, both linked in the description to today's episode. Dave, thank you for joining us on Red Pill Nation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so to get started, I kind of want to just start the way I obviously usually start, which is I want to know about, your content is so in-depth and clearly comes from a very, very learned place. And it's usually pretty long form. What made you kind of want to make the content that you make, which often kind of speaks out against what can sort of collectively be referred to as the left to an extent, or what I call woke supremacy? What kind of made you start the Distributist channel and want to go into that?
Well, originally I had a smaller blog when I was in a PhD program in grad school. And I was just using this to communicate general ideas that I was mulling over about the state of the culture war. I was at that time a social conservative of variety, but I was much more of a normie conservative, middle of the road kind of person. I was Catholic, and I was dealing with the developments in America post 2012, which I think the year 2012 and 2013 will be seen as sort of the turning point that got us to where we now obviously are in 2020. And I suppose that I was, at the time, I was an avid watcher of people like Sargon of Akkad, and it always felt like he was leaving something out. And it always felt that the conservative movement was leaving something out when they were critiquing the left. And really, my own YouTube channel, I started doing it to try to fill a gap, to point out the obvious mistakes that people like Sargon were making when they were trying to understand the left, and then trying to constructively critique their efforts, but also augment my own understanding. And I think in doing that, I kind of opened up the Pandora's box of a lot of other intellectual revelations. Nothing that really undermined my core values. I still am Catholic. I still have conservative type values. But it did lead me to pick up a bunch of people that I had read very long before and dismissed. A lot of the thinkers from the neo-reaction school, a lot of older thinkers like de Maistre and Spengler, and give them another look. And then subsequently, a lot of my YouTube channel has been incorporating lessons from those older thinkers into an analysis of the mainstream currently. I do long-form video essays because I don't know how to write shorter things. A lot of what I do is tackle these issues from my own perspective and introduce concepts as they've occurred to me, doing as best I can to cite the sources where I think they originally come from. But I'm not formally trained in philosophy or anything like this. I have an engineering degree, and most of my knowledge stems from an undergrad when I was in a great books club with an individual who wanted to do a more classical education on the side. But this has been a hobby of mine, but it has in some sense been a passion for the last, it's been 4 years since I started my channel at this stage. So it's been a while, but it's been a great ride.
Yeah. And your content is really incredibly informative. And I want to sort of touch on what you said about filling in gaps kind of in the world of conservatism or in what at this point has sort of become a new alliance of just anything that isn't left to a certain extent. It's kind of this strange alliance that's begun to exist, because that kind of leads into one of the other things I wanted to talk about perfectly, which is you, in your essay about Mencius Moldbug, you brought up the idea of kind of the Republican Party as what is supposedly the opposition that we get here in the United States in particular to the left, that it's sort of Orwell's loyal opposition or outer party. It kind of exists within the Overton window and within the bounds that the Democratic Party kind of gives to it as that sort of inner party. And I wanted to ask you just if you had any kind of specific criticisms or if there's any failed strategies you want to point out. I know that you sort of fill gaps in some of the commentariat with your content, but what about the Republican Party itself, which obviously has its hands full right now with a potential Supreme Court vacancy and a presidential election where they're currently lagging in the polls, but we know how that turned out last time. But in any case,
I mean,
what are some of the criticisms that you'd have of the Republican Party in that respect?
well, I mean, is the failed strategy something that's done by the Republican Party, or is it the Republican Party itself? The Republican Party, you could see it either as an end in and of itself, or you could see it as the means to obtain a non-progressive solution or direction in society. As means of perpetuating itself, I'm not so sure you could do a better job than what people like Mitch McConnell are doing. If you want to continuously exist, then being slightly to the left, slightly to the right of a Democratic Party that's continuously moving left is probably a good strategy. But it's not a good way of actually changing anything or holding back any of this madness that's coming out of the left these days. This is one of the main theses of Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug. And I mean, it has a lot of different causes. The most proximate is the fact that power in the society is determined not, I mean, it's determined in sort of a secondary fashion in the actual government. But when you look at how decisions are actually made, the lasting decisions, they almost always are done in cooperation with the media and the academy and a variety of other unelected apparatuses, some in government, some not. And there are, in those fields, non-elected government, NGOs, the academy, and the media, you'll see that conservatives and Republicans have almost no representation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a completely asymmetrical battle going on. That collective that we, the education system, basically the informational apparatus of society, which in neo-reaction people call the cathedral. This thing that Democrats dominate ensure that all their changes will be permanent, and all of the changes that Republicans make will be fleeting, temporary modifications upon the larger apparatus of progressive change. This reality has been the consequence of the fact that for a very, very long time in America, we've had sort of two narratives about what America is. One has been the classic founding fathers myth that we were a nation born in liberty, a Western nation that had these Western values, Christian values, and that these were formed inside our Constitution, and that we're carrying forward this legacy. That was the classic Republican idea of what America was. And then the Democratic one was this civil rights narrative, this continuous unfolding of more and more rights. Largely focusing on the rights, the post-war civil rights victories that were won largely through the Warren Court, but then afterwards through activism. And the story of America was the continuation of this expansion of rights and this expansion of new identity groups that need to be protected. It's apparent that the older of the two narratives, the conservative one, this narrative has been dying. It's been dying at least because there's no one in the informational apparatuses of our society to tell it. But it's always hard to discern cause from effect. But in this absence, the only narrative that we have governing America is the sort of civil rights narrative that's carried forward by the Democratic Party. Christopher Cantwell had an amazing book called The Age of Entitlement about the civil rights era and how it has constructed our modern narratives. And he concluded the key issue, the key thing that we've learned since 2012, and this has to do with gay marriage, but also a variety of other victories the left won during that time, is that once an issue was phrased in terms of civil rights, the elites of this country would work to ensure that it won 100% of the time, and its victories could never be undone. So in light of this, the narrative of civil rights is absolutely supreme. And in that, the left is absolutely supreme. And anyone who has a problem with this new social order and what hasn't yet emerged as a majority governmental order, but that seems to be in the workings, at least if you look at the demographics, anyone who has a problem with this new system is sort of on the outs. And so this is how you have the phenomenon of the dissident right, which is everyone who understands the futility of the Republican Party as an endeavor, but also isn't a progressive or has a critique of progressivism that isn't just they need to go further to the left. If you fall into that very, very broad category, you are broadly dissident right. But this means that there is a growing number of diverse people with diverse interests that are completely alienated from how our government actually works. And I don't know if America can sustain that for very long.
Yeah, and with this phenomenon of the dissident right, it sounds like there's something to differentiate here between obviously the mainstream conservative movement, but also to an extent the intellectual dark web, which is sort of a collection of mostly progressives who are sort of coming from the civil rights narrative overall at the end of the day. You know, Brett Weinstein still seems to have somewhat of a civil rights narrative, being a central figure in the IDW. Is there kind of a really important distinction to be made between those two groups, or do they actually have the potential to align themselves in an attempt to try and put up some kind of resistance to the what I call woke supremacy, just sort of this incursion of the social justice, civil rights narrative on society at large?
I think that politically, they will definitely fight on the same side. Politics is based on us versus them, friend-enemy distinctions, as Carl Schmitt famously said. So because we have the same enemies, we'll likely be fighting on the same side. But I do think that there's a critical intellectual difference between the IDW types and people who could be broadly considered dissident right. And every time I say dissident right, I just want to assure people this is an incredibly broad spectrum of people. It's like saying atheist. It includes basically it's defined purely negatively. So all I'm saying is someone who does not think that the Republican strategy could work and also is not progressive or to the left of where progressives currently are. So the reason why the intellectual dark web is, in my opinion, not truly dissident right is because they believe, like you said, in the civil rights narrative, and they want to keep the civil rights narrative. They just want to arrest it at some fixed point. Usually the IDW people want to arrest the civil rights narrative somewhere between the 1990s and 2012. The difficulty, and this is something that only people like Mencius Moldbug were talking about 10 years ago, but it's increasingly becoming something that mainstream people like Jonathan Haidt, well, I don't know if Jonathan Haidt's explicitly said this, but certainly Christopher Cantwell and even other mainstream Republican or conservative figures are pointing this out. Once you concede the moral logic of civil rights, how can you arrest its expansion? In the name of what? What force, what narrative force gives anyone the right to say that this new civil right we invented or discovered is not the same as all the civil rights we discovered in decades past? And if you don't have an answer for that, then you're doomed to become Republicans 2.0. And this is the problem with Brett Weinstein in particular, or the Weinstein brothers generally, is they never give us any narrative that does not just feel like a previous iteration of the civil rights narrative. And nor do they ever stipulate a value that should take priority over someone's claim to be the recipient of a civil right. And because of that, you can easily see their trajectory as being a reiteration of the Republican Party, which to me is not only a boring proposition, but also kind of a depressing one. The one thing I hope to see coming out of 2020, I've given up hoping on seeing anything good come out of 2020, but the thing that I hope the most for is that we just stop having the same mistakes over and over again. And I think that would be refreshing, right? Is to not continuously do this again and again.
Yeah, that point you made about kind of how there is this concession to the civil rights narrative that makes it's sort of like making yourself concede the argument before you've even started it. I think there's a great example of that pops up a lot. And it's when people say, oh, I don't think you should be legally compelled to use certain gender pronouns, but I will use them invariably when asked to. I won't apply any scrutiny to someone's claim because, I'm somebody who, in a situation where I was asked by, let's say, a close transgender friend of mine, in a private conversation use their pronouns, I'd certainly entertain the thought, like, I guess I just want to have a conversation. But it certainly, and Ben Shapiro's actually made this point, obviously a very mainstream conservative, but even he's kind of caught on to this. In a political discussion on the topic, you sort of concede the argument from the get-go when you go like, oh, well, I will do this, but I just don't think I should be legally compelled to do it. Well, that kind of concedes the argument in a way.
It concedes the moral argument.
Yeah.
Which is the only, and this is something that I don't, even with the Supreme Court going up for grabs, I want to make it clear that I do not think that victory on this issue is at hand, like a lot of people are talking about on the right side of Twitter. But if you look at the most successful social conservative cause in the last 60 years now, or maybe more like 50 years, it's by far abortion. And the reason why is that the conservatives from the get-go had a narrative about why they supported abortion, and they never conceded the moral issue. If anything, they got some moderate left-wingers to concede the moral issue in their direction. And I don't think that there's going to be any progress on abortion, largely because I think policy is determined by power and not popular opinion, and certainly not winning some kind of abstract conversation. But insofar as right-wing issues can be won or successful, the framing around abortion, where the moral righteousness of the pro-life position is constantly front and center, that's the only way to go with any of these things.
Yeah, and I struggle to think of many other examples. It is sort of a pessimistic outlook when you try to think of the other examples where people on the right or people who are resisting woke supremacy have really got down on the moral level. Because even when it comes to freedom of speech, kind of that first thing that seems to be bringing people together in that sort of anti-woke alliance, there's actually a wing of people who are sort of like not super worried right now because they're saying like, oh, well, the government isn't infringing on people's free speech. But I always try to point this out to people. Free speech is like sort of, I mean, really before it's a legal value, it's a moral value. Like, and that's the more important version of freedom of speech, is that as a society, forget about what the government's doing. As a society, if we can't have that open discourse and we don't support that on a social level, if we don't support that in our homes, in our schools, in even private institutions like at the workplace, if we don't just kind of have this moral framework that people need to be able to say what they believe within a pretty broad context. I mean, there being maybe some very pragmatic exceptions for actual threats of violence. There is sort of this concession that you start to see less and less from people, even in the intellectual dark web, but from the broader kind of like moderate left, I always run into people, and it's very frustrating, who say, oh, well, the government isn't infringing on your rights. And it seems like people have this disconnect between the ideas of legal and moral arguments.
Well, I mean, this is part of the concessions made by Republicans, is that they essentially allow the Democrats, or the progressives in general, to get away with this notion that moral common sense lay inside the progressive frame of doing things, and that the only things that were moral with a capital M were extraordinary moral statements made by Republicans or conservatives or religious writers. So you have this famous quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm going to misquote it. But she said, whenever I hear the word moral in a legal proposition, I grow suspicious, which is insane when you think about it, because all laws are normative. Therefore, all laws are implicitly moral. But they frame this, the thing is that the narrative frame of the progressive media and informational institutions was that progressive concepts of normative behavior extended from pure rationality, from the way things had to be, and that any prescription beyond those ideas were extraneous and suspect. And I think this is just part of the fundamental brokenness of our political discourse. When young people come into the political discourse these days, they enter into a political discourse in college where there are just designated winners and losers. you know what the right side of a conversation is before it even gets discussed in class. And so you see these Generation Z people or these younger millennials coming out of college, and they don't even really know what it's like to have a conversation. They just know that they need to have the good opinions. And I guess, in some sense, this is historically normal. This is probably how people thought when going through religious schools to a large degree in times past. But our entire system, in some sense, is relying on the fact that we don't have thinkers that think like this, that we have a more open dialogue. And so what happens is we end up with a government and an informational apparatus that's really not very, very well adapted for the kind of thinkers that we're training.
Yeah, it's what's going on with, so from my perspective, I actually only graduated from university a few years ago, and you're absolutely right about the fact that there's no actual conversation that can be had. My experience was particularly interesting in that I went into college in around the time 13, 14, when things really started to kind of creep up. And then by the time I got out, 4 years later, it was just exploding. There was like a meltdown. It was after the 2016 election was my senior year of college. So I just sort of watched as when I went in, I could have these discussions with people. I really could. I was in the college Democrats, and I could actually have discussions with other Democrats. And you're probably guessing, and you would guess right, I'm no longer a Democrat. But in any case, I would have these discussions with other young Democrats that were pretty cool, like pretty open-minded. Like I could, this was back in 2013, and that very, very, very quickly, while I was in school, I watched this sort of the beginning of this cultural revolution, although I know in many ways it goes back further, but certainly this phase of it where it's just completely out of control, where, you go from Evergreen College to the evergreening of America. Evergreen College was a little bit after I graduated.
Something happened in 2012 to 2013. That was the year.
Yes, I was just going to ask, what happened?
Well, a lot of different things happened. The first thing was, if I can think of more than two at this stage, but the first thing that happened was Barack Obama entered his second term.
Yes.
And so he felt sort of unconstrained. He didn't have to go for election again. And there was very odd about the re-election campaign of Barack Obama in 2012, is that the Democrats doubled down on a lot of culture war issues that they had taken on, right? The one that comes to mind most prominently for me is the HHS birth control mandate, which was a big deal for me. And I talked about this a little bit in the live stream previously. It kind of proved to me that you can never disaggregate culture war politics from good government ideas. But he essentially walked into the whole Catholics are trying to take away your birth control. And of course, he also got a big turnout due to the Trayvon Martin shooting, which had happened just that summer, I believe. And so he had done what a lot of Democrats thought was impossible, which was he was able to win re-election on an unpopular policy position. Obamacare was not very popular, but through simply winning the culture war. And this communicated to Democrats that a new era had dawned, and that they were the people who were in charge of the culture war, and they could win by doubling down on it every single time. Furthermore, during 2012, you saw the first pro-gay marriage propositions win on ballot in a variety of states. And at that point, the establishment of Washington, D.C. began to see gay marriage as a fait accompli. After 2012, it was no longer a debate, and it was no longer, and after 3 years later, it was no longer a policy debate.
Exactly. It got so fast. Just 3 years later, it was incredibly rapid, going from a debate where it was pretty 50-50, and then Barack Obama coming out in favor, a number of Democratic senators and even some Republican senators. And again, like you said, just 3 years later, completely done deal.
And this is the thing, is because if you remember, and I'm a little bit of an older millennial than you are, but you probably don't remember the 2000s, because in the 2000s, the Democrats weren't necessarily so sure about any given policy, but they were damn sure about gay marriage. And everyone was calling it a civil rights issue for our own age. And if you talk to people, a lot of the reasons that the issue they felt the most confident in, the issue they felt the most sure of, was gay marriage. They felt that they were doing something good for the world. And by pushing this issue forward, they were manifestly making the world a more tolerant place without necessarily any downside, the way that Obamacare had messy downsides, right? Even if you think that policy was good, it unquestionably had messy downsides. But after 2012, the main signaling issue that you could just embrace in college and be kind of in the cool crowd, that became mainstream. So people had to look for new things. And I think this kind of led to the explosion of different social justice issues in 2013 and 2014. Everyone was looking for the new gay marriage. And furthermore, I think, and this is the last reason I'll give for why it happened in 2012 and 2013, I think that that just happens to have coincided with a lot of the silent generation professors in the university retiring. I know that my father was a professor at a university, and he retired. And I know a lot of people in his generation retired around that time. So there was a massive changing of the guards, and university classes that were basically staffed by boomers and people who were younger than boomers. And whereas the silent generation lived most of their lives inside a conservative order that seemed to have worked, and were notoriously a more conservative generation than the boomers that immediately preceded them, the boomers, the Xers, and the millennials basically lived in an America where progressivism was always seen to be the winning side and always seen to be right. So if you encountered a new progressive issue on campus, every professor knew that, in 30 years, this is going to be mainstream. In 30 years, this is what everyone's going to be doing. Curtis Yarvin, the guy who blogged under the name Mencius Molebug, when these statues started falling down, he says, conservatives, rest assured, in about 10 years, everyone will be aghast to think that we ever honored the memory of George Washington, the slaveholder. And I think maybe he's wrong about the time, but he's wrong about the general direction, right? The general direction is, if it is a progressive piety in the universities, it will eventually win 100% of the time. And those are the lessons you would have learned looking at the culture war since the 1960s.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that's interesting to think about, particularly for me with my experience, in that I went to college during a very, very strange time. What you said about sort of all of the young people looking for the next gay marriage, I remember that very distinctly. And I remember just how important it was to incorporate support for that issue into your identity, irrespective of your position on other issues, to the point where even a lot of college Republicans were in support of same-sex marriage. And my experience with that, and I think this might be interesting to discuss, is it's weird because I feel like I'm very, very much the exception to the rule, in that I very much had a mentality about gay marriage, even going into 2015 when it was legalized, where I was like, if gay marriage gets legal, and this is going to sound incredibly naive to anyone listening and probably to you, Dave, honest to God, when I was in college in 2015 and I saw gay marriage was pretty soon going to get legalized, I said to myself, things will be pretty, I actually was like, I'll be satisfied, socially, as a liberal Democrat, I was like, once same-sex marriage gets legalized, I will kind of get off my high horse of social issues, being sort of morally superior, is kind of the mindset that I was in. I actually did have a thing where I was like, there is this point at which I wanted to stop, kind of the intellectual dark web mindset you were talking about before. And I didn't realize how much I was the exception to the rule. I actually thought everyone was on the same page with me, and that I had heard about some of the gender non-binary stuff and I was like, nah. But I think the vast majority of people, like you said, were just like, what's next, especially among young people. And I was so naive, Dave. I
believe the same thing in 2007, but it's not hard. It's not difficult. We shouldn't sit around wondering why we believe this. People like very prominently Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the original spearheads of gay marriage were literally telling America that, America, in order to heal your cultural war wounds, what you have to do is legalize gay marriage because it's a contentious issue that's tearing this country apart. And as soon as you legalize it, then we can go back to figuring out how to reduce the divorce rate, how to reduce single parent families, how to bring back family values. And once you give them gay marriage, progressives will then be on board with family values because they'll have an ownership stake in it.
Yeah.
Did any of that happen? Of course not. I mean, gay divorce is incredibly high, and gay relationship dissolution is incredibly high. That's never an issue with any activist organization. There's no money in that. There's no effort in that. There's no passion behind that. That's something in the Family Research Center. They're still interested in divorce, right? So you see sort of a complete inversion. I just think that we were straight up lied to by people like Sullivan. I don't know. I assume that he actually believed that this would be some kind of unifying issue once it was passed. But I think anybody who took a broader historical perspective would have immediately recognized that victories of civil rights movements do not lead to some cathartic moment of unity. It didn't happen in the original civil rights in the 1960s, and it didn't happen, well, really any time that there's been a civil rights victory since then.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to something that I really wanted to discuss with you, which is in all of this, you mentioned early on the idea of the cathedral, kind of the combination of all of the core institutions. I usually refer to them as like a big four, and I'm sure there are some others, but I usually refer to them as essentially education system, especially higher education, the news media, the legacy media, the government, and big tech, which was kind of the last one to kind of show up. And that these big four institutions are badly, badly infected with woke supremacy, the social justice narrative ideology. And that one of the things I've been thinking about, and maybe this is a slightly more optimistic note, I'll see what you have to say about it, is that we do see some cracks, particularly in the news media. We see some cracks in the stranglehold that these institutions have. Also with the Democratic and Republican parties, I mean, the candidacies of populist figures like Donald Trump, who was successful enough to become president, and Bernie Sanders, who came certainly a hell of a lot closer than the Democratic Party establishment wanted him to. But then there's the emergence of a figure like Joe Rogan, who actually is, I think, a credible threat to the mainstream media, at least for now. And I wonder if you consider there to be like maybe a window of opportunity for the resistance, sort of the alignment of the dissident right, the IDW, all of the groups that want to catch a foothold in the fight against woke supremacy, sort of the entropy of the left. Do you think there's potential to maybe replace some of these institutions as they crumble? Because the news media in particular, and actually to an extent, even just college as an institution, I think people are waking up to the fact that maybe they shouldn't be going to college. Like if I were to recommend to someone now, I'd honestly say probably don't. And I wouldn't have said that just 2 years ago, especially as coronavirus makes them pay full price for online education. But in any case, do you think there's education? Do you think there's potential in kind of the crumbling of these institutions, the rise of figures like Joe Rogan, Donald Trump, and Bernie Sanders? Is there maybe something there?
There's something there. I mean, what we're seeing is this thing we call the cathedral. It's becoming more brittle. And what it's doing now is that it's sacrificing credibility for raw power, which is what institutions do as they age. They start off, or I should say cultural consensuses do this as they age. They start off being very, very young, and everyone loves them because they're fresh and new and their ideas have been tried and they're so full of promise. But then as they get older, they feel like they need to maintain their popularity. And the only way they can do this is to simply consolidate power. And this makes them very, very brittle. But it also makes them very, very terrifying. And so I should say that there is a lot of opportunities to come up with alternatives that are not prominent. I don't think it's really a window, because I think that these opportunities are going to get more, it's a gap more than a window, because I think these opportunities are going to get more prominent as the cathedral gets more and more and more brittle. The only thing that has to be kept in mind is that I think that if an institution you build as an alternative is seen as a competitor to an institution that has power, it's going to be attacked with increasing levels of brutality. And you said the legacy media is dying, kind of. In a sense, legacy media is dying. In another sense, it's getting folded into big tech. Legacy media is going to become an outgrowth of YouTube and Facebook. It's going to be the media that the cathedral approves to be promoted via social media sites. And, things like Zero Hedge and Joe Rogan, maybe in 5 years, links you post on Facebook to those people will just stop working. You already see this in BitChute, right? Which is an alternative to YouTube. The links, at one point, the links stopped working on Twitter altogether. And now I think they lead to a page that tells you that it's an unsafe link that could lead to dangerous and subversive information. I don't know if they got rid of that, but it shows that that's within their power and that's the direction that they're going. So I don't expect them to lose power immediately. What they're going to lose, what they're losing currently, and where the opportunity exists for people who oppose them, is that they're losing credibility. And this enters into a very, very dangerous phase of the culture war, where people are demanding narratives that don't go along with the mainstream. But the mainstream is increasingly paranoid of those narratives and the people who spread them. And it's increasingly willing to use more and more power to push those things down. I can't say this is a good situation, but I don't know a way around it. The argument, though, that the Republicans can somehow do the informational apparatus in, or that by winning seats in Congress we're going to do anything, that doesn't seem to be very historically evidenced. I feel this thing in some way needs to kind of burn out, but I think where we are after it burns out is largely going to depend on how successful we are at building underneath the radar while it's still alive.
So almost this idea of building sort of the groundswell of support and the people who are ready to utilize newer and better institutions, whether it's media narratives or education systems after kind of the collapse of everything, but also not thinking of it too much as like this fight that we're going to try to win. Really, we're just going to wait it out because these institutions are going to collapse and we kind of have to swoop in at the end. Because I think that for a lot of people, including myself, the more attractive narrative is let's win this, let's like blow up the Death Star, let's have Joe Rogan replace CNN and like,
Well, I don't know how you're going to do that, right? Because Joe Rogan, the thing is with CNN is that if CNN feels threatened, it's going to call on its allies in the university to back them up, right? And then you're going to get all these studies that come out of the university saying how these alternative media organizations are dangerous, they're spreading false news.
That already happened with the New York Times, yeah.
Yeah, it already has happened with the New York Times, but this paves the way for regulatory power being brought against the competitors in a way that, it's hard to resist. I don't know. I mean, this whole destroy the Death Star thing, I sympathize with wanting that. I don't see how that's supposed to proceed. I don't, and this is something that's sort of a very common reactionary opinion, but I don't really think that power comes from populist groundswells. I think it comes from a committed elite of individuals who have visions about how society should run, and they slowly convert more and more people to that vision of how society should run. And that this vision can then benefit from popular groundswells. But aside from that, without the guidance of those core leadership, without the guidance of the core leadership, these movements don't really accomplish anything. And the question is, what is there? We don't really. The elite class of the society is overwhelmingly sucked into the mainstream universities, and we do not yet have a very good alternative to this. And so, all of these pushes that have gone against the mainstream "quote unquote" cathedral, they've all been flailing. They've all been, "Oh, we hate you guys. We're going to do something. We don't really know what." There's lots of things Trump could have done to actually hurt the apparatuses of the media and the educational institution that hated him, and none of those things were accomplished. He made them angry, but he didn't actually he didn't actually, shoot them where it would actually destroy them or threaten to destroy them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up in that, as we get closer to the election, I am kind of covering it more and more, even though I don't want this to be kind of a typical, election coverage show. But
Mhm.
just in terms of my position on Trump, it's always kind of been that I don't believe the worst or the best narratives about Trump because, one, when people call him a fascist, I say I don't think he is really intellectually capable or interested in fascism. Matt Taibbi recently made a point about this, about how could you believe that, considering that he can't even keep his cabinet together and he's constantly hiring and firing people. But then also when people talk about, he's going to be the one who's going to bring down woke supremacy, I'm like, I don't think he even knows what it is. Like, and then people pointed to the Mount Rushmore speech and were like, oh, look, he understands the culture war. And I was like, he was given a speech with a bunch of buzzwords because somebody saw tweets from James Lindsay and Christopher Rufo and thought they had potential. Like, I don't think Trump really intellectually has the capacity, and I don't necessarily think he's stupid, but I just don't think he really has the desire to understand, and he certainly doesn't understand the culture war on a fundamental level. And I don't think he's ever demonstrated that. I just get very frustrated when people point to him as a savior figure. I'm like, he's so far from that. He's far from the fascist dictator of the left, obviously, makes him out to be. But I think I always say this about Trump. I think he will become shockingly irrelevant once he is out of office. I think people will be shocked how quickly he's not really that big, like, in the picture.
I mean, he made the Democrats angry and afraid.
Yeah.
But he didn't destroy any of their power bases, nor did he convince them that they don't own the future. The Democrats feel they own the future, not least of which because of the demographic changes, largely brought about by illegal immigration in this country. And, I think for a while they were afraid that he might reduce the immigration rate to the point where conservatives' higher birth rates would threaten the idea that they would eventually come to a supermajority in this country. But that never happened. Nor is the path of that happening very, very easy to see. But unless you can strike at one of these core strengths that progressives feel like they have, they will continue to believe that they are the inheritors of the future, that they are the harbingers of a new order, and that all smart people naturally are progressive. And if those ideas remain in progressives' mind, I think your prospect for unseating them with a direct attack is very low. Not to be too black-pilled.
No, but look, it is as it currently stands. Things are pretty dire. But one of the things that I've thought about is, I know that the Republican Party is pretty damn useless, but in terms of the sheer power of the presidency, and I don't even necessarily mean the political power so much as the informational power. When the president speaks, people pay attention, whether it's good or bad. Like, people are obsessed with Trump on the left and the right. This is just the way the American psyche is very much, I want to hear what the president is saying. And I've thought about how, what if somehow, some way, and sort of Brett Weinstein has alluded to this with Unity 2020, even though it's not going to work. It's an asinine campaign that will not work in a million years. But he is sort of getting towards this idea of, what if we had people in the Oval Office who came from outside the cathedral? Now, of course, many of Brett Weinstein's proposed ideas come from inside the cathedral, as do his potential candidates, perhaps. But this idea of, I've wondered about, 2020, I don't think there is I don't think we're going to be, I don't think things are going to improve whether Biden wins or Trump wins. But maybe in 2024, 2028, if somebody somehow, and maybe they're circumventing the two-party system entirely in doing so, and that's why I alluded to Unity 2020, if somebody got in there and was just able to use the power of the presidency informationally to, like, and sort of the closest thing Trump has ever done to this was during Bill Barr's testimony on the Hill recently, they played videos of the riots. And people saw those videos. And I know that probably not very many people were convinced, because the Democrats immediately said, these are peaceful protests. And of course, people will believe whatever the Democrats tell them. But what do you think of this idea that there's some potential to just sort of at least getting another narrative out? And also because I think people want to respect the president. And if they see somebody who is easier to respect than Trump, I think he makes it a little bit hard to have a broad base of support. Whereas if you had somebody in there who was unimpeachably patriotic, and it was undeniable, even the mainstream media with their hardest spin attempts couldn't get it done. the first person I think of is Dan Crenshaw from the Republican Party. But, there may be some better ideas. Is there potential to use that office to an extent for its political power? You might as well if you got someone in there. But just on a psychological level, just talking to the American people, having almost something akin to FDR's fireside chats, where it's like people are going to tune into this because it's the president, whether they like him or not. And if it's somebody who is more articulate than Trump, go ahead.
Yeah, but like for the fireside chats that FDR had didn't actually change the country. His policies did. The issue we're dealing with right now is that you could elect a very charismatic president into the Oval Office, but the author of our destruction are ideas that come out of the university, and they stem directly from how the university is set up. And it's not just the university; it's also the other apparatuses that we've been talking about in this program: the media, the unelected governments, the NGO, the unelected government officials, the NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. Without substantial change to these institutions, I don't see how it isn't just a momentary aesthetic change without further reform.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think about how like I said before, the legacy media in particular seems to be destabilizing, although as you said, it's kind of relying on its allies to kind of take on a new form. But I think maybe one of the things that could be useful in this country, and this is something I would never have said just a couple of years ago, is a mass don't go to college movement, which I think there always kind of was this thing that was made fun of in conservative circles and of course now it seems very prescient, but the idea of colleges as purely being indoctrination centers, which I think was more true of exclusively the grievance studies at first, and then eventually actually became literally true as those studies kind of branched out through the social sciences and then through the hard sciences. But I think that there's actually potential just with the cynicism towards the idea of college among millennials and people younger than millennials, and even Gen X to an extent, of maybe having some kind of movement to circumvent the academic system that we have that has become a system of indoctrination. That could be an area where I think the legacy media has the most rapid destabilization right now of all the core institutions, whereas the Democratic Party is pretty vulnerable. Big tech is not very vulnerable, unfortunately. But I think maybe there's potential in the academic space to start like a real movement, because the logic is there of just why would you do this thing if it's not economically valuable? It certainly isn't at this point for the most part. And it's not really socially valuable, especially if coronavirus persists and it's all online. What do you think about that?
I think that might work. Again, you'd have to figure out some way. I think that could work if you had alternatives in place to kind of pick up the slack. You'd also need cooperation. I mean, this is also the difficulty. All these things are a good idea, but if we have the entire professional class, if we try the strategy with the entire professional class trying to subvert it, I don't think it's going to go very far. And this is sort of why I think the dissident right is in the place that it is that, and a lot of people don't like this, but if everyone in the smartest colleges is like, oh, there's a mass don't go to college movement, we have to find it and destroy it. That's really tough because of the fact that these institutions are going to carry with them so many other institutions. It's sort of impossible to build in that environment, right? It's basically like you're trying to build another brain and overpower the brain you currently have. Getting a message, because the media is going to call this, you're going to have the media like interview the one person who's like, they told me not to go to college, now my life's ruined. You can already imagine how this is going to go, right? And it could be a great idea, but unless you have buy-in from at least some of these elite people, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be very, very difficult to get this off the ground.
Yeah, and I think I do see your point about as long as there is a large contingents of the elites in one or more of the institutions, the whole system is going to undermine any effort to undermine them. But I sort of have thought about, there's a character, this will be my second Star Wars reference of the day. I think it's a record for the show, but there's a character in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, who is he's like a crime lord. And one of the things he says is that he's supporting the Republic, which you wouldn't expect because he's obviously this dark side evil character, but he's supporting them because if the Republic falls, it's bad for his business. There's no ruling authority. There's no, peace in the galaxy whatsoever. And he can't run his illicit cartel. And I've thought recently about, like, could you get through to someone, like if you sat Jordan Peterson down with Mark Zuckerberg and Jordan Peterson explained, and Mark Zuckerberg's not stupid. He may not be the best guy in the world, but he's not dumb. If you sat down Jordan Peterson with Mark Zuckerberg and if you somehow got him, I know this is impossible, but say you got him to really stay in that room for like 4 hours or however long it took for Jordan Peterson to explain, like, if you do not do something with the awesome power that you wield through Facebook, and, you could do this with any number of figures. It could be Elon Musk. It could be, who obviously has shown some openness in particular. But if you sat down with one of these very, very powerful figures that could maybe turn the tide a little bit among the elites, and you explained it to that, could you kind of just get them to understand, like, we're actually going to face like a Mad Max situation that you're not going to like? Like, could you actually just?
I think you could convince them. I think you could convince them of that. But if after you walk out of that room, everyone from Harvard calls them up and tells them that you're full of shit, then, what are you going to? I mean, I don't think that message is going to stick, often. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. Like, we don't need the institutions to do anything in order for us to succeed in some kind of effort in this regard. But we do need them to not actively try to destroy an effort in this regard, if that makes sense. And
so should there be an element of stealth? Like, does it need to go unnoticed? Does it not need to be too obvious? Should it be subtle so that it doesn't get targeted as fervently?
At this stage, the only distant institutions that I can see coming out of our current moment are ones that are not necessarily stealth, but that are not seen as direct competitors of the cathedral itself, that operate totally that at least externally appear to operate completely in parallel to the operations of the media and the operations of the academy. I think that in 5 years, this might not be the case. In 5 years, if the academy realizes that it's on a path of destruction and a civil war erupts, and you've got like rogue elites realizing what you just said, like, we have to leave this or die. Hey, maybe it'll be in 2 years, right? But we have to see a lot of professors, a lot of journalists, a lot of government officials and executives signal that this can't go on. We can't keep on living like this. And if you see those kind of people saying that, then I think that's a signal for now we can move from implicit competition, pure parallelism, to explicit competition and parallelism with the ambition to replace these institutions. If you try to do explicit competition and threatening parallelism in an environment where every single elite is 100% fixated on destroying you, I don't think that's a recipe for success or for prudent use of your time, to put it lightly.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I think, in talking about all of this, it makes me think about going back to the video you did on Mencius Moldbug's ideas, kind of the intro to his ideas. The idea of the left as this sort of inevitable, or leftism, or social justice, woke supremacy, whatever you want to call it. You can call it by many names. People know what it is. It's the idea of it as an inevitable entropy, situation where, would you? My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, from what you said in that video in particular, was that we should be, or maybe you were just saying this is one option as opposed to the other. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was you were saying there needs to be more of a mitigation, brace for impact mentality than a blow up the Death Star mentality. That instead of thinking about halting and reversing this process, that there really is more of a process of, I mean, pessimistic as it may sound, is sort of mere survival and maybe having something better on the other side in the long run. But that in the short run, that well, I mean, basically, you see my point. I
That's
mean,
my opinion. Yes, my opinion is that we need to be thinking about bracing for impact. Might not be the right way of putting it. There's no way that we're going to build an institution, and this is something that this is another challenge for the right wing, is that successful institutions create something that's needed in the moment. For instance, if you look at another great civilizational collapse, the fall of Rome, uh, in the 5th and 6th centuries, monasteries were developed, and they were developed for a specific need that was very pertinent at the time. There needed to be a place for, well, first for religious worship, which was seen as central. Secondly, to house people who were outside of society, which is another essential thing. That there were a lot of exiles and the like that they couldn't operate inside the main society, and there was also there were also a need for religious teaching. But through the monastery system, also were preserved many works of Roman and Greek philosophy, and also Christian philosophy, like Boethius, that would have been lost to the ages had these institutions not been there. So it is kind of a challenge to come up with an institution or an organization that serves a purpose, but also helps us brace for an impact. And I think that this is the role that reactionaries really seek to fill in the modern world. And I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do at all. I just don't see how. I don't think that there's another thing I think we need to keep in mind. I'm not so sure how much like a brace for impact. I mean, it's obvious in 2020 that this situation isn't working and we're headed towards some kind of collapse. But if enough elites realize this and bail out, it might not even be that bad. But regardless how much they cover it up, it will be a collapse of sorts. We will need to radically rethink the university system. We'll need to radically rethink the media. We'll need to radically rethink all of these things. We will need to radically rethink the concept of civil rights, and even having people involved in politics. I think that this is something you also say. Everyone now, regardless of how uninformed they are, is just like 100% on board this political thing. That feels like something that's very, very new to me. I don't remember the situation being like this when I was a much younger child. Maybe I wasn't aware of it. But when you think about it, politics should be the purview of people who actually like thinking about controversial things, who like having deep conversations and thinking about deep ideas. If they're just something for people to put on their Facebook feeds so that they'll get a bunch of applause and validation, I think that's a very, very destructive perspective. So all of these things, they need to be radically reconceived and redesigned. If there's an elite in charge that can take direction of this, then I don't think that, the collapse as such might only be institutional and might not actually have larger physical impacts. But in absence of that elite waking up or a new elite coming about, we are going to have a bit of a hard landing. And I think that, I am a believer that we have to build in parallel for that kind of impact. And I know when I say this, it always sounds like I'm a doomsday prepper, but that's exactly the opposite of what I want to imply. The people who were building the monasteries and the kingdoms of the Merovingians weren't doomsday prepping. Well, I guess in the case of the cathedral, the second coming of Christ, you could see the monasteries as doomsday prepping in that sense. But they weren't like, building bomb shelters and
right.
storing up huge quantities of dried food that they never eat. They were doing something that was very useful in the time they lived in. And I think that, as the cathedral gets more brittle, as it destroys more and more things, I think the thing that people are going to start, you're going to start hearing this more and more. You're going to hear the sentiment like, why couldn't we have this thing that I remember from when I was a little kid? Why couldn't we have movies that didn't have obvious social justice messages? Why couldn't we have a more realistic take on history? Like, that was nice then, wasn't it? Why couldn't we just have that? And that will be the symbol. And I think you're seeing this a little bit now. And I think we should start building now. But I believe we'll be seeing this more and more and more. You'll be seeing completely non-political desires for things that the mainstream no longer can produce or no longer wants to produce. And that will be the symbol, I think, of the time to really expand these parallelized projects.
Yeah, there's so much to think about there, and I'm both excited and terrified at the prospects of seeing these things materialize. And I think that I think we could do several more hours, but we're coming up on our hour, and I just want to. There's one thing that I always ask every guest, and that I want to ask you, Dave, and that's what concrete actions do you kind of recommend to people in this moment who are generally opposed to this thing, whatever we want to call it? I call it woke supremacy. What are things that you can recommend, whether it's just something that treats the symptoms and soothes the pain of going through it, or it's something that actually is helping, and that, because people want to help. I think there are a lot of people who are like, I want to do something. I don't want to just sit around waiting for this thing to destroy our society. What, if any, actions do you recommend to the everyday person who isn't, a public figure?
I think it's become a leader in your community. I did a series of videos called, well, I'm still not done with them, called Content Culture War and Content Creation, where I overview different ways that you can help the dissident movement. But I think that it comes down to being a leader in some capacity, whether that's being an organizer or an artist or a teacher. I think the main problem that we're dealing with in the present day, and this has only been exacerbated by 2020, is that more and more what is valuable to humans is moving away from relationships with each other and towards these little dopamine experiences they get from engaging with media. And I think that the best thing you can do is to find a local community, or failing that, even an online one, but make sure it has real people and that you're having real experiences with them. And then work to build up something that you value, that you want to see preserved inside that community, that you want to see get better. And I think those kinds of communities will be invaluable for taking the next step. And I think we sort of are at the next step where we currently stand, just because I think it's very, very obvious that the way things are going on right now can't continue.
Yeah, I think that is fantastic advice, Dave. And the only thing I'd add on to it, just in terms of the way that I kind of frame some of what you said, is I always tell people, find other good people. Don't let yourself be surrounded by people that make you feel like shit all the time and make you feel crazy. Yeah. Find other good people. Find other, if you want to say, red-pilled people. I really should embrace that term, considering it's the name of the show. But I know that I know the connotation it carries in many circles. But in any case,
Red Pill was invented by Mencius Moldbug. I believe he was the founder of the idea.
Was he the first?
Yeah, he was.
I don't know if he was the first, but you could be right.
I'm pretty sure he at least claims he was, right?
Yeah.
In which case, he thinks being red pilled is being some kind of like neo-Jacobin or neo-Jacobite or something like that. It's kind of really LARPy, but I don't think that its association with the 2017 alt-right. I think we should just use it generally for being disillusioned with the mainstream media and educational apparatus.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, red-pilled people need to find each other. It's very, very important on multiple levels that happens. Mm-hmm. But in any case, that's close to our time, Dave. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we sign off, is there anything you want to promote?
Well, not at the moment. I have my YouTube channel and it's just going along. So if you want to look me up on YouTube, I'll be there.
Absolutely. All right. So everyone check out the Distributist. If you like this conversation, there's a lot more of Dave's content there on the Distributist. So go check it out. This is Red Pill Nation with Scott Veritas. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.